Yes.
Hey, we're recording now, so you know.
All right, recording, but all of the microphones are off, so please click your microphone before. Welcome, everyone, to the May 4th Cottonwood Heights work meeting, the Planning Commission. And we will be going over the business items, which I think is just one item on the agenda tonight for the sensitive lands ordinance. Is there anything else that we need to discuss during the work meeting?
No, I don't think so. That's all we have.
Okay,
If you want, I can give a Dover Hill update at the end, maybe. It's been a while on that, so we can save that to the end, but
okay,
give the commission an update on what's happening.
That'd be great.
all right. Well, then we'll turn it over to staff to talk about the sensitive lands.
So want me to go first, Sandy? Okay, we're gonna start with the riparian piece on its own, and then we will go to the full sensitive land stuff. So I'm just gonna make sure this comes through Zoom, okay? Okay. And then, okay, perfect. Everyone's seeing it, okay. Microphone's on. All right, I think we're ready to go. So just since this is going to be in a public hearing tonight, we'll go over this piece in the business meeting, just basically giving the background that this effort isn't an update to address the discrepancy in our code, that being riparian standards are referenced but not included in the code. We've gone through that in past commission meetings, so I'll just wait till the business meeting to do that full bit. As I've mentioned to a few of you as you've been coming in, we haven't made any changes to the draft ordinance itself. So the language that I've passed out to you guys tonight is just the same as it was the last time you reviewed it. Tonight, our update's going to focus instead on just giving a little bit of clarification per some of the comments you guys made at our last meeting. So we'll go through a little bit more of the mapping analysis that picked up the structures in the proposed riparian protection area. We'll talk a little bit about how the draft ordinance would work in practice with development and redevelopment. And then I'll give you a little update on some of the coordination we've been doing with other agencies. So just as a reminder, the main concept for this ordinance is this idea of buffer areas. This is standard practice for most riparian ordinances and just hinges on the concept basically that the property adjacent to a waterway is divided into various areas, with each area being regulated a little bit differently as far as uses go. And that area closest to the waterway, which is area A, being the most stringent with what's allowed. So as a little update on mapping analysis, we were able to get the number of primary versus accessory structures. So we'll see here, if you look first in area A, which is that chunk of property closest to the waterways, GIS analysis picked up 17 primary structures, which would be like a home, and then 6 accessory structures, which would be things like sheds or detached garages. And then in that same sequence for area B, we have 65 primary structures, 17 accessory structures, and then moving to area C, furthest away from the waterway, 98 primary structures and 6 accessory structures. So this data paints a little bit of a picture of most of the homes that are existing being farthest away in area C, where they actually would be allowed to be built today. But there are, you know, a handful, 17 plus 65, that are in area A and B, that if they were new construction under this proposed ordinance would not be allowed in that area. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means for if those homes want to do remodels or additions, but wanted to start you off just with giving this breakdown of the different types of structures. I'm gonna try not to ignore you guys. I always turn this way to see the screen and then I kind of miss this end. So we'll talk a little bit now about kind of 3 different categories of development that I wanted to run us through. So the first being just maintenance or interior remodels of existing structures. The second being additions to those structures, and then the third being actual new construction of new structures. So these flowcharts are maybe a little bit odd, but I wanted to just try to visually convey how it might work in practice. So we see that with maintenance or just interior remodels of an existing structure, if that structure meets the riparian protection area standards, you can do those remodels. And if it doesn't, you can do those remodels. So that basically means that, you know, even if you had a structure that it's existing that now is in that riparian protection area, you would be allowed to maintain that structure. You would just be allowed to do interior remodels and renovations that aren't enlarging it, basically. Moving on to additions. If your addition meets the riparian protection area standards, it would be allowed. If, however, the addition does not, you wouldn't be able to permit it. So a situation here might be, you know, maybe you're doing an addition on a structure that sits within the riparian protection area buffer, but the addition you're doing is to the front side of the house and it's not encroaching any closer to the waterway. And so that would be allowed. If you wanted to do an addition perhaps off the back of a home that's already sitting in that buffer area, that would not be permitted under the standards that we're proposing. And then third, building a new structure. Obviously, if you're building a new structure and it meets the riparian protection area standards, it would be allowed. If it doesn't, if what you're proposing conflicts with those buffer zones, we would not be able to permit it unless it's being reconstructed following a disaster where an existing home was destroyed. There's a provision in our code that kind of outlines that act of God process. I wanted to give a little bit more overview on the construction of a new structure part. So I did throw together this table as well, just kind of showing the difference in how structures would be treated in the different buffer areas. So if we look at area A, which again is that closest chunk to the waterway's edge, new structures, whether they're primary structures or accessory structures, would not be allowed to be built that close to the waterway under the standards we're proposing. If we go to area B, which is the kind of the middle section, primary structures, which again are homes, are not allowed to be built in that area. But accessory structures that are under a square footage threshold, under 200 square feet, can be permitted. And then of course, when we move to area C, which is the furthest away from the water's edge, you can build either a primary home or an accessory structure. And again, none of these things have changed since we've introduced these to you, but wanted to just try to provide a little clarification on how the proposed language would work in practice. And we can come back and talk about any questions you guys might have. But kind of the final update here is just letting you guys know that we've started coordinating with FEMA, with the Army Corps of Engineers, and then also with the Forest Service on these standards. So we haven't received feedback yet from their staff, but as soon as we get it, we'll bring it and share that with you and potentially incorporate their input into a future draft. So a lot of information, and if there's any questions, we can do that. I want to leave enough time for Andy's section, which is the more substantive part, but does anyone have?
Just a quick question on the coordination
Yes.
with other agencies. What is it you work with them on, to be in alignment
Yeah.
with theirs, or I mean, what, I'm just curious.
That's a great question. So the idea is that we want our process to be as harmonious with theirs as possible for ease on really everyone's ends. It can be difficult when the city requires one thing and then maybe another jurisdiction or entity requires their own. So we want to try to be as in harmony as possible. So I've just been trying to look for, through their feedback, any red flags where they would maybe pick up like, oh, you know what, we explicitly say this isn't allowed and you're saying it is, or also just learning from their expertise. And I've received such helpful feedback from them. They were one of the, through this interagency coordination, I think with Salt Lake County Flood Control, and actually the Utah State Engineer, they both said, you know what, you should measure from top of bank instead of annual high water line. So I think it's kind of twofold, trying to be kind of in harmony and also just, this is our first stab, so wanting to benefit from their experience. But that being said, we do of course want to be true to what we need for our community and what works for us. So it doesn't have to be exactly what works for these groups, but it's nice when it coordinates. So
Yeah, I just ran into this on a project where the FEMA floodplain area was quite a bit different than the top of bank
okay,
that was surveyed,
okay,
which impacted the development by, I mean, it's 27-acre development, but it impacted by an acre
wow,
because of the difference between the map, what
Yeah.
FEMA showed,
Yeah,
and
that makes
what
sense.
was actually surveyed. So I think it's really critical that we dial in what we can use as that authority, or,
yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I hope that we get some of that from FEMA.
because I think the county uses top of bank,
They do, yeah,
which would make sense.
they do for flood control purposes. I don't know what their like planning department uses, if any of with their measurements, but for flood control, I know they do top of bank.
Because
So
was zone A, zone B, and zone C, was it based off of, like
Top of
currently
bank.
top of bank,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Yep.
Which is a surveyed top of
And the
bank.
way it's defined, and let me see if I can click over here. The way it's defined in the ordinance, if I come down to these definitions, gives a little bit of guidance on how it can be measured in different circumstances, because sometimes you have a bank that's really obvious, where it's just the top of the bank, and then you have horizontal plane, and other times it kind of tiers. So there was luckily some good guidance in other ordinances on how that might be measured, and it does actually coordinate with the 100-year flood surface elevation if there's multiple hinge points. So it basically just defines that it can either be derived from a single hinge point where the slope meets the bank, or multiple hinge points closest to the 100-year flood surface. But yeah, I'm hoping we get some good feedback from FEMA that make those two things coordinate as well as they can.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from anybody? Okay, great. Well, we can certainly talk a little bit more in the business meeting. We'll go through that, but I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Andy.
Okay, thank you. I have a few updates on the rest of the sensitive lands ordinance. We've got some members of the public here. Thanks to everyone who's joining us today. I know for a lot of you, this may be the first time that, oh yes, let me get these. The first time that you're getting a review of this. In the work session, typically I have a discussion with the Planning Commission, and so I'll probably just focus on the updates since the last time that you've all reviewed it from the April meeting. But I do have slides from the previous presentations, and if there's anything that we need to go over, I'm happy to pull it up and go over. But for sake of time, just give a quick overview and then dive into the changes that have been made in the past month. As you all know, this has been a long process that staff has been working through. We've presented to the Planning Commission periodically over the past year or so. This will be the first time that this ordinance is open for public comment. So because it affects the entire city, just about, at least more than half of the city is covered by some sort of sensitive lands hazard. We put out a notice in the city newsletter that goes to every property advertising tonight's meeting. So tonight we will be opening this to the public and taking feedback, and that's one of the major things that we want to get from tonight. A very quick, very broad overview of this project and the intent. It started with a desire to update our hazard maps. So the sensitive lands ordinance covers all sorts of geotechnical and geologic hazards, things like earthquakes, faults and liquefaction, flood zones, steep slopes, landslides, debris flows, and those type of potential hazards that could occur in certain areas. We had updated data that we wanted to use to create new, more accurate and up-to-date maps. And so that was kind of the driver for all of this, is updating the maps. As we did it, we ended up doing kind of a rehaul of the entire ordinance. So our geology consultant has made updates. The intent is to be technical updates, clarifying language, best practices in the field. So we've received feedback from our consultant. Geostrata. Tim was here last month to present to you and answer questions, as well as the Utah Geological Survey. Thanks to Commissioner Chappell, we had some really good feedback, and that's all been incorporated into these latest drafts. A few other updates that we're going to be going over. You already heard from Samantha on the riparian corridor watershed protection. We also have some changes to the steep slope ordinance, which I'll go over here in a minute. The proposed amendments, the intent of all of this is to clarify or to make things stricter to be up to the current best practices. So I know that we've received some comments that were concerned that perhaps you maybe be loosening the requirements or opening things up. That's not the intent here. Of course, we do want to get feedback from the commission and the public. If there are changes that need to be made to tighten things up or fix anything, we do want to receive those comments, and I tried my best to include all of the feedback that we've received up to date, and we'll continue to make more updates over the following month, depending on the feedback we get tonight. But all of the changes are intended to be, don't necessarily want to say that they're all more strict or we're not making things stricter just for strictness sake. But I do think that that's generally what is being achieved here, is that this is more accurate and more clear, as well as requiring more work and oversight for these type of projects. So one of the major topics that we've gone over several times with the commission that we've received feedback on is the steep slope section. The existing ordinance basically says no development is permitted on slopes exceeding 30%. And it's just a period as it's written now. One of the reasons why we're touching this up is that in the definitions of this ordinance, development is defined as basically a primary structure, a home, or new commercial business or building. Things like critical infrastructure, so utility systems, hospitals, first responder buildings. That's what was defined as development in the current code. Did not include things like roads, accessory buildings, or retaining walls. And so often we would have people asking questions or wondering, well, can I build a wall, maybe flatten things out? Now it's no more the 30% slope, now I can build on it. And the code did allow cut and fills of up to 12 feet. And since a retaining wall was not defined in the definition of development, we haven't really had issues, but we did want to make sure that we're being very clear in this ordinance. So that's why I've underlined the new code says no development, including structures and retaining walls. We added roads to the definition portion of development. The intent with that was to really try to make it clear we don't want any walls or any buildings really of any sort on these slopes that are steeper than 30%. But so we've added an exception. The intent behind that was so that this new code would not be overly burdensome to existing lots. People on smaller lots, how we have it written now is under an acre, that have isolated slopes, something that's not going to affect the stability of someone else's property and wouldn't cause other issues, could be safely developed, that those would be okay. We wouldn't cause any issues for existing properties while still making an effort to preserve these natural slopes, which provide so much benefit, and also, you know, making sure that anything new that's developed in these areas is safe and stable in event of earthquake or other disaster. So with that in mind, that's why we're looking at this. Of course, we're open to feedback and we want to get this right. We've changed it several times based on the discussions that we've had already. Some of the tweaks that we've made just in the last month So previously it said no development on these slopes with the exceptions, and it lists a few things. One is that it would need to be an isolated slope. So the last draft we had said they are clearly isolated from other areas that exceed 30%. City engineer felt that might be a little bit vague. It could be interpreted in multiple ways. And so we've rewritten that to say the slope's not part of a larger contiguous slope that exceeds 30%. And then we had some discussion with the Planning Commission last month about the language that was included that said this exception will not apply to natural slope areas in excess of 30% connected to the Wasatch Mountain Range. Obviously, that Wasatch Mountain Range could be broadly interpreted, could be confusing. And so we've changed it to say east of Wasatch Boulevard. It's still saying the exception will not apply to natural slope areas east of the boulevard. In essence, you know, that we're looking at the foothills between the canyons. And that's where we're at with this. Looking for feedback on this, and of course, happy to continue making changes. We can go through the rest of it. But maybe what I'll do is I'll go through some of these other ones, and then we'll leave some time for discussion. So avalanche hazards, you may remember last month we presented a new appendix. The feedback seemed to be that this might be a little bit overkill, that there are potentially some properties that could have an avalanche, or could be at least in an area where it needs to be studied, protected. So what we did is we removed the appendix. That way we don't have to check every single development for the certain avalanche criteria, but we did leave in the language saying that a hazard study could be required by staff as needed. So as determined by the Development Review Committee, which is a staff including Public Works, Engineering, and Planning and Fire.
And maybe we can just add to, as a reminder, there is not currently an avalanche section in SLUDs. It's not something we're pulling out. It was just an idea we kind of floated. The feedback we got was, yeah, that may be less applicable, leave it in, but just maybe change the way it's worded. So just as a reminder.
So we've got that. We can still require an avalanche study. If someone says, I'm going to build something, you know, close to the border of the city, up the canyon or something, and it's identified by staff as something that needs to be looked at, we can still require it. It's just not one of these hazards that has to be checked in every case. A few other changes that we've added based on recent reviews: the vegetation and revegetation section. We've added a requirement for vegetation plans to be stamped by a licensed landscape architect. So we require these plans whenever someone strips landscaping off of a hillside. They could just be, you know, previously could just be by anyone. This way, make sure we've got a stamp on it, know that things are being done correctly. We removed the maximum grade requirements for the streets and ways section. Previously, there was a different requirement for streets in sensitive lands areas. It allowed streets to be steeper than everywhere else in the city. The preference of our Public Works Department is just to have the same standards everywhere. So we just removed that maximum grade and left it. So now all streets are subject to the same design requirements. The land disturbance permit is something that was in the code originally, requires a whole bunch of documents to be submitted for the city engineer to review for any land disturbance. We had removed it in the last draft with just replacing it with some simplified language saying you submit this permit, it goes through the city engineer, and essentially leaving it up to them, their, you know, department policy on how they would handle those. Feedback we got from engineering was that they liked having these stricter requirements in the code and to leave them in, but just to clarify that it applies to sites larger than an acre, or if it's a smaller phase that's less than an acre but part of a larger development, that those are the projects where this is required. We're not requiring a whole bunch of documentation for someone, just digging up their garden or something if they happen to be in the area. So that way we kept everything in, but clarified when it's required. And then the review for geologic hazard reports. You may remember that we've added a 45-day timeline for reviews. The intent behind that was that at first it said just we'll review it in a reasonable time. That's up to interpretation. Someone might argue that 2 days is reasonable for them. So we wanted to put a deadline on it, but the feedback we got was that we don't want it to be a hard deadline that could cause some issues if there's maybe an overly complex or technical project that needs extra time. So we softened the language a little bit. We're endeavoring to complete it within 45 days, but it still kind of sets kind of the tone or some expectations for how fast we'll be working on these. So with that, those are the newest changes, but happy to take feedback. We expect to get feedback from the public in the meeting, but please.
I have a question, as I
Sure.
was reviewing this version, and I was out of town for the April meeting, so I was very disappointed to miss the GeoStrata presentation. There were a couple of changes to the setbacks on the faults, specifically a reduction from a 20-foot minimum setback to 15. I couldn't find what I was looking for in the notes. And is that something we can talk about, or is that something?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was brought up in one of the public comments, and we had in the appendix originally, the minimum setback said 15, and then in the body of the ordinance, it said 20. The documents that we received from UGS, and from what I understand, what's in the building code, the minimum requirement is 15. And so we chose that if the 20-foot setback is something that the commission prefers, we can keep that in. It was more consistency. We want to keep it the same in the body of the text and the appendix.
And I completely understand that. Now, as I looked at this is something I rely on other experts on, right? It's not my area particularly of expertise, but 20 feet I always thought was small, right? So, but okay, that's what this looks like. But as I look through what's in the document, there's actually a table in the document in the appendix that's by occupancy structure. And it's basically single family homes is 15 feet, but basically everything else it goes up. And so I was curious about that. I actually didn't find it in the current version of the International Building Code. I don't know if it was moved to commentary and I just didn't get there this afternoon. But when I looked at research, I looked at other locations where setbacks are commonly used and maybe a little more active seismic regions. Noting that our region is technically active and the Wasatch Fault is technically active. There's actually a lot of discussion about, unless it's proven otherwise, you should assume that there are branches of your fault that are 50 feet proud of that fault. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that one, because I don't think a reduction is a good idea unless we have a really, really sound reason for reducing that. 15 feet is not far.
Sure.
And when we look at, for instance, the extensive reports that have been done on the gravel pit sites, there is a geologic occurrence when that fault moves, that the soil actually tilts.
Go on this button.
Sorry, that the soil actually tilts and rotates, right? You can see that in the geologic record. So if you think about the four faults that are kind of, as that fault system expands right at the mouth of Big Cottonwood Canyon, they're not going to just only occur, these tilting are not going to occur in 40-foot segments, right? 20 feet on either side. It's going to be significant, right? We don't know what that looks like. And frankly, it's very complex. And so I think if we were to say, put some guide rails on this, right? For something under 20 or 2 stories, then maybe that's something where we could look at, I think of like a single family residence maybe, because again, we're looking at a lower profile structure. I think we're looking at a displacement of a smaller number of people. But fundamentally, for just having to be a blanket 15 feet, it seems really ill-advised for our geologic setting and the types of projects we know are forthcoming in our community.
Sure.
So just so I make sure I take down notes accurately, are you approaching this from a place of feeling like 20 would be an ample starting point, or are you feeling like it's something where you'd like to look at more than 20? I just want to make sure I document this properly.
So, and I actually asked myself that question,
Sure.
like what would make me feel good? And right, because it's again not my area of study.
Right, yeah.
And also taking into account the table that is currently included in this document, and it's, this number times that number times the, plus the
For
angle of the
occupancy,
fault
right?
for occupancy. But there's a table, and then there's also an equation, right?
Mhm.
And that equation assumes a single fault. And so, if I feel like it's just oversimplified right now
Okay.
for a system that is too complex for that kind of simplicity. It's just not ordinate, right? And so just because it kind of sparked that thought process, I feel like that's something that we need to take a thoughtful approach to, maybe engaging against Steve Bowman or some of the other folks at Geologic, Utah Geologic survey, or even there's typically for our community, there'll be like one researcher who really knows that area. For instance, Les Youd in Utah County for liquefaction. Like there's certain people and who are the well-renowned experts for this area. And so if that's one of the gentlemen that was involved in the new quaternary fault maps, I can't remember, there was somebody who's been to visit the city council and this commission, I believe, to speak about the fault maps. So somebody like that, where we can just say, okay, help us put some parameters on this.
Sure.
So we know when we don't need to overcomplicate it, and where's that boundary? Because I know for me, the gravel pit is so complex that 15 feet seems reckless in that instance, but it might not be, maybe closer to target, or in a different part of the city.
Sure.
I thought I noticed in one of the comments that someone was arguing for 25 feet. But that the only authority they gave for it is, I think it ought to be 25 feet.
Well, that's the issue. There are people who we can ask.
I've just
Yeah.
made general notes to continue to kind of flesh it out. I think the sentiment I'm hearing at least is like, we want it to be clear and practicable to implement, but we want it to be flexible enough to apply to different circumstances.
Yeah.
And kind of cover the complexity of the fault system, which I, of course, am not an expert on either,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I've made notes to look into that. And
Sure. Yeah, well, definitely. That's great feedback. Yeah, we'll follow up on that.
So there was one other issue with respect to that, as I looked at some of the language on the setbacks, and there was discussion about structures that are not it's like they're not habitable,
Mhm.
right? And I guess maybe, and this is maybe a question you can answer, a parking garage, is that considered habitable? And I don't know.
It applies to different.
We've heard this. The answer is if there's an attendant in it for a certain number of hours per year, then it's habitable.
What about if it's attached to a structure above? That would be habitable.
Then I'd ask you, how's it attached?
Yeah, great question.
Is it floating? Is it magnetically suspended? Yeah. So that whole discussion, like, understanding what that might be, because
okay.
a parking garage that is attached in any way, either or horizontally or vertically, can impact the performance of that building in a seismic event. And so I think that one where it is, again, kind of a conditional, if it's standalone, Yes, a person could be parking a car, but maybe it's not technically considered habitable. We want to make sure we feel
So-
comfortable with that.
So
right?
clearly define what habitable means.
That
Yeah.
question has come up before too about swimming pools.
Mhm.
Is it habitable? Is it, so we can flesh out maybe some more scenarios
Yeah.
to help define that.
Yeah, all
Traditionally, there's
sorts.
nothing that could fall on top of a person, but in a parking garage, we know that things can fall on top of anybody who's passing through.
But yeah, no, I mean, that applies to garages just for a single family neighborhood or
Mhm.
things like decks and sheds, which we see a lot of.
Good
So,
feedback.
yeah, we can dig deeper into some of those for sure.
I think the International Building Code's pretty clear about occupancy types, and maybe we can tie it for habitable.
We'll make a note
versus-
to look at IBC and see how they handle it, and IRC too.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. I don't know if any,
Can we get more detailed? Pop your mic on there.
Oh yeah, if anyone's mic is off, if you'll hit the button, Chris, it looks like yours is. There we go.
Can we get more detailed maps at a certain point? The PDFs that were attached to our files can't be zoomed very much at all.
sure,
So
yeah.
there, I mean, I can see a 30,000 foot view, so to speak, but I mean, if I zoom in at all, the notes are illegible, and even defining the structure, I can't tell where the boundary is for anything. on
We
maps. I
have-
know that makes them huge files, so
Right.
I completely understand functionally why I don't feel like you guys are withholding information or anything, but if there's a better way for us to access those, I do think it would be nice for us to nose around a little bit on those. So
We could even look at, sometimes GIS will prefer the interactive ones
Mhm.
where you can click on different layers. So our, I do want to know our GIS specialists will be at a conference for a few weeks. So we'll try to coordinate to get something, but it may be a bit of a work in progress with her absence.
We may have it already. I can get you a link.
We can definitely do it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just whatever is going to be easiest for you guys. Don't break your backs over it. I just am more interested. I mean, just even, I'm sure that the big version of these files, if there's some, I mean, it could be Dropbox just for our group, even just to
If
be
we
able
end
to
up
zoom it.
getting a link to the interactive ones, we can even just include it to the like email that we send out with the packet, and then you guys can click into it. And
I know this is an ongoing issue where they're large data sets, but I would tell you that more than once in the last year, I thought, man, I know they're trying to just, because you're already having to send us massive files already by email, and for some, it's harder than others to open those. So I appreciate the sensitivity, but I do think that every one of us at a certain point has wanted to do a deeper dive, and it may save questions a little bit.
we can make
So,
that happen.
thank you.
I had a question about, I noticed that, and this is not any of these structural kind of questions, but in terms of some verbiage that was deleted about if there are disputes and defaulting to the stricter criteria, I think is how, I'm sorry, I don't have it. And I didn't find anywhere where it talked about that anymore. Is that just been totally eliminated, or?
I think we just moved it from the end of the chapter to the beginning. I'll double check and I
Because
can
I did
pull it up.
I did a word search on conflicting and,
Smart.
and just to see if it would pop up, and everywhere I looked, it looked like it was crossed out. But maybe it could be I missed it.
I thought the last time we talked, we were going to refer to the general dispute section of the city code.
So there's, I think
Or
there's two
map.
things. That's the appeal process.
Yeah, I see appeal.
This is a pretty common language that's in most chapters of the ordinance where it's like, if there's something contradictory, the more restrictive
Apply.
provision is
Yeah.
what takes effect.
I didn't see
It
that
should
that
be in
was,
there.
I saw where it was crossed out, but then I never saw where it
Oh,
was.
here we go.
Put back in.
Yeah, I
Put back.
think we just moved it up. It's so right after, and maybe the search, depending on how we do the PDFs, it might not be searching right.
And I could have been looking for conflicting and not conflict.
So,
If you didn't want to read every word again of.
Okay, I stand
With all the
corrected.
changes.
Yeah.
no, that, I mean, this
It's
is
easy to follow.
very
Sorry.
I'm
important.
impressed you picked up on it.
It was towards the end of the chapter originally, and we just moved it up. So from what I remember, we've included, I think it's the same language. I know in that,
I thought it-
the one where I had the 3 columns comparing everything, I had mapped out what was moved to where, so I'll double check, but
I'm sure it's
yeah.
fine, yeah, I'm sure it's just,
We'll make sure,
again, I look for, I'm sure.
we'll make sure
conflicting.
it stays in there.
One of the appeal sections, it talks about moving it from the DRG to just the city. Is there a thought process for why?
For appeal proceedings.
Yeah,
I think that was just the intention to follow our, DRC is just a staff committee. We have an appeal authority and regulations that guide that. Seemed better to just route everything through that formal appeal process.
and what it said was to staff, not to the appeal authority. Let me see if I can find it.
If I remember correctly, I'm sorry, if you find the number, we'll pull it up, but I think it was that the application
Mhm.
just comes into the staff. And so I'm guessing, I think that's the change was when they apply, they can just come into the front desk and submit the application and we'll take it and process it from there.
And then get it to the appeals authority.
I do know there was this may be related or maybe not at all, but there was a line in here before that basically could have been interpreted that the city council had to establish the DRC for every single application that came in.
Mhm.
And we have tried to clean that up and say, this is who the DRC is. And that's the staff group that takes the first look at all these things.
Is that in 1972, 060?
It might be.
When analyzing conditional use permit or other land use proposal, and then they cross out the DRC and put in the city.
The one I'm looking at is 1972-110. And it's subparagraph
Right here.
D. And it's the last two sentences
So the part that's the city will review the information and
instead of the
render.
DRC. and
Yeah,
render
I noticed a
decision.
few inconsistencies with that
So
use
that-
throughout.
I think
I like your
Yeah.
appeal language because I think I see exactly what you're
Yeah.
saying, Mike.
Yeah.
I'd feel more comfortable with that if unless I'm misunderstanding what that appeal process would be.
I think this is probably saying the same thing. The DRC shouldn't be the appeal authority, but it's saying here, the city will review this, the applicant may appeal following the appeals process
But it sounds
contained in
like,
this chapter. And if you read that later on, it's an appeals hearing officer that may
That makes
appoint
sense, yeah.
it sounds,
experts to weigh in on. it.
sounds like Commissioner Mills, you're interested in having that maybe clarified in that sentence with something like the city via the appeals hearing officer, or is
Yeah,
that what you're getting at?
That's it, because it says,
City's
when it
appeal
says that
process.
the city will review the information, render a decision, that doesn't sound like.
That
an
feels
appeal.
unclear. Okay.
It just, I mean, I think
Yeah,
we're hopeful, but I think that from an external perspective, I
Like
think that will
who's-
engender trust of
who's the
the
city?
residents that the city in this case would be the
Okay.
appeals officer.
oh, is this saying though, I think what this is saying is, someone submits, say, a building permit application. And we say you need to do a slope stability analysis and they do it and we say, this isn't good. And that's that first decision. The DRC or the city staff says, no, this doesn't meet the code. You didn't follow the process.
Mhm.
If they dispute that, then they may then appeal that decision to the
So
hearing officer.
you may want to, in the actual definition sections, because you define what city means and it's a whole bunch of things, but you conspicuously appeals officer is not listed. You can interpret it probably to mean agent as applicable, but if you just want to add in appeals hearing officer, that might actually help in some of these sections.
Yeah, we can definitely look at making it more clear. We can see how that would be a confusing passage.
Yeah, because I don't actually see that you have an appeals hearing officer defined in the definition section.
Yeah, we probably have it defined in maybe the appeals chapter or somewhere else, but since it's referenced here, that's a.
You can infer it because it says or agent. So I would interpret that to the or agent to mean the appeals hearing officer, but why not just spell it out?
Sure. And I would anticipate that if there's conflict between an applicant and the city about the geohazard study area maps, the idea that it's a conflict between the city and the applicant, I think there's some difficult optics that says, well, if there's a conflict, then the city will decide, and that's the final word. It's like, well, we would already have offered.
Who should be that authority? Because this is saying
Yeah.
staff's gonna review, and let's say you're clearly in sensitive lands and the applicant says, no, I'm not.
Yeah,
And we say, no, you are, you have to do these things. And they say, I don't want to.
yeah,
And then there's a standstill, so then it kicks down into the appeals process if they want to really escalate.
And that's what I want to make sure is clear, Mike, that it's.
That's how you want
that
this
that's
to,
a-
okay.
That the escalation is obvious, that there's a pathway,
Okay.
like the, not talking like an
Yeah, yeah.
org chart or a chart
Okay.
or a flow, but that it's obvious that, okay, if I'm a property owner and I feel like I'm
You don't
having
agree, yep.
conflict.
You
I have
don't want me to
recourse.
make another flow chart?
I love a good flow chart.
Great.
We're good at flow charts, so.
I mean, don't you guys
Okay,
have,
that is the intent. So we'll make sure it's clear.
for the regular permits, don't you have some of the flow charts or the process charts out on the website anyways?
Uh-huh. Yeah, we can definitely do one for this.
Yeah, because then you could just bifurcate it in terms of
Yep.
like sleds, not sleds, but you disagree.
I've got your notes.
I have 1972.02. There's a word minimal. Maybe my notes should have been
No,
a
I
little
have
bit
those
more
too.
clear. But I had a question about minimal and how is, that new word there. How is that defined?
Right.
Minimal structural damage.
It comes up, I actually think it came up for me too. There's minimal and
There was another one I had
another one,
too,
and I
the
think it was actually the
ample.
riparian. It's
Oh, okay.
just vague.
So define minimal.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
how is
That-
that, how would that?
What's the
What does that
threshold?
mean?
Yeah,
Okay, that's really good feedback. And I'll make a note that it's in both the larger sleds and then also in the riparian.
Yeah, I could be misspeaking on that, Sam. I can't remember.
Well, and the
which one I saw
intention
it,
is that ultimately we'll combine the two. And so the definitions that we've been using for the riparian section would probably kind of be merged in. So we want to make sure we're being consistent between the two.
And I would note that this is actually a big topic of discussion because our building codes are based upon this idea of life safety. Meaning if you have a perfectly designed building to the code, after a design level earthquake, the structure might be a total loss, but you should be able to get out your occupancy alive, or your occupants alive. That's indicating a significant amount of damage if you cannot repair it. But so I think it becomes this, how do we define this problem? And it's one, frankly, that I think as a community, we haven't really resolved, right? Because there's sometimes a mismatch between the expectations of the public versus the implications of our design standards. And so I think if we can tie it back to the language in the building code, that's always helpful because then it changes with our community standards theoretically, right?
It keeps us up to current best
Yeah,
practice.
yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. I'll add that.
I know when Geostrata does reviews for projects that come through the city, Tim always talks about the standard of care or standard of practice, which is kind of what is widely accepted as basically the professionals have done to the best of their ability based on all the knowledge we have, the best to address this. And when it comes to things like this, where it's, essentially saying, do your best to make it safe, there may be something along those lines that we can point to. This is just according to the accepted standards of the, relevant field, or we'll look around, but I would imagine that we might find something along those lines to clarify this.
Yeah, I think it's do what a professional in that similar situation, in this given set of circumstances would do, but based on the type of building, the type of occupancy that it's designed to react and come out of that event at whatever level is defined in the code. So a hospital needs to perform at a higher level than a single family residence.
And that's similar to kind of what you were getting at with the.
Yeah,
setback.
it's a risk category. So a hospital building should be able, maybe they won't be fully functional, but it should be able to be repaired immediately.
We
because
can
It should be, so that, I'm trying to give
Right.
a benchmark for what that
definitely look into
means.
that.
Yeah.
So I was looking at 1972-04 applicability. And it says that detached accessory buildings are not designed for home occupancy are not required to comply with provisions of this chapter. So does that fall into this same kind of this? I was wondering why if someone's building
A shed.
or a garage, I mean, that this would not apply. It kind of raised some flags to me that we're even saying that there's some kind of dwellings where this is not applicable.
And to give, but again, to tie it back to the building code.
Right.
If you had a place that sheltered a haystack in an agricultural building, there are still design requirements.
Sure.
They just allow for more damage in our design level events than a home or a business.
Sure, and that makes sense,
So-
but that's what I'm saying, maybe that's
language.
why this language is the way it is because of that fact. I guess, I mean, but I just detached, okay, I mean.
Well, I think you're right. And the way that you're reading this is the saying, if you're just putting a shed in your backyard, you don't need to
Go
do a
for
fault
it.
study and dig up your yard and check it all out. But maybe that might depend, like you're
Well,
saying, on the size of things.
Because
or how
the
it's
way
used.
they're also the way I thought of this is a detached accessory building during an earthquake could still damage down, I mean, a place next to it. I mean, it could fall onto a home where.
Or fall into a waterway.
Or something, yeah, so that's why I was concerned that about this applicability.
That's good feedback, and we can continue to kind of flesh that out on what the proper way to define that is. I do want to offer just a really brief time check. We could absolutely go up to the hour, but if we wanted to do a Dover Hill update,
Yes.
we are 3 minutes to the hour,
I think it'd be great.
whatever.
Thank you. I was
Whatever
gonna
the
say
chair's
something
pleasure is.
similar. Yeah, please.
This is not scheduled for action tonight, so we would just anticipate, take comments and continue it and just keep going.
Share my screen here.
Okay, very, very quickly, the fault trenching has been completed on the Dover Hill Chapel site by Ivory Homes. The black lines are the trenches they dug, the red lines are what they found. This is not the city's review of the report, this is the initial report, but it has this map that's actually kind of helpful. So the red are what they've identified as, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but fault traces that merit mitigation or avoidance. And actually what you can see is the pink area in the middle are the more major faults that just have a no build area
It shows up
buffer around them.
blue on that screen, so if you're looking there and
That
seeing
middle
blue.
dark area. Then there's a different color. It looks orange to me, but the next color to the outside of that is kind of an orangey color. In the report, they recommended, yeah, these are fault lines, but they're more minor, so we can mitigate them with engineering and build closer. Our city ordinance disagrees with that, and those will all have a minimum fault setback as well. It's the 20 feet that's in our code right now at a minimum. And then the green is areas that no major traces were identified. So what you can see here is the eastern portion of this property that the city was offered is fairly clear, and the quote unquote developable portion is not. I don't know exactly what this means right now, other than if the commission sees anything else on this site, it will look very different than what we've seen previously. So that's the 2-minute update on this.
Thank you, it's a good update.
Have
Thank
we
you.
had any interaction with Ivory as a result of this?
Just in reviewing this report and sending them our review of it.
Have there been any discussions between the developer and the city in terms of a swap of positions?
That's pending real estate, so that's not public information. So I'm gonna just defer on that.
Thank you for that.
All right, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second,
Okay, we have a motion, a second.
There you go. Did you guys like my
All
banana
in
wine?
very good, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.